The Roaring Twenties offered endless prosperity, but by the early 1930s, the Great Depression had turned that dream into a nightmare. What was once a time of booming stocks and lavish parties quickly collapsed into poverty and widespread unemployment. How did the good times turn so bad and so quickly? Let's go. The 1920s was dubbed the Roaring Twenties for a reason. It was a time of new technology, booming business, rising stock markets, and cultural change. After World War I, the US emerged as an industrial powerhouse. Radios, refrigerators, and cars were becoming an everyday item. Jazz clubs, flapper fashion, and speakeasies defined the nightlife. And cities like New York, Chicago, and Detroit were alive with optimism. And nowhere was the optimism louder than Wall Street. Stocks weren't just for the wealthy anymore. Everyday Americans could go and invest. Teachers, factory workers, even shoeshine boys, right? The stock market seemed like a quick way to get wealthy, and there was no point in saving because all you had to do was invest and you would get rich. And a big reason for this surge was buying on margin. So instead of buying the stock for full price, they would put down 10% and borrow the rest from their broker. For example, you could control $100 of stock with only $10 of your own money, and if the price went up, your profits were multiplied. But if it dropped, you still owed the full $90 and could lose everything. And if the value fell too far, the brokers could issue a margin call, forcing people to pay up or sell at a loss. It was a high reward but high risk situation. Everything seemed like it was going up, but under the surface, cracks were forming. While the cities boomed, rural America struggled. Farmers were overproducing, driving prices down and drowning in debt. Meanwhile, wages were stagnating even as productivity soared. The gap between the rich and the poor was widening, and most of the wealth was concentrated at the top, while the average household survived on credit. The crash began on Thursday, October 24th, 1929, a day that would go down in history as Black Thursday. The stock market opened with panic selling, and by mid-morning, the volume was so high that the ticker tape was hours behind. Major banks and investors tried to step in to stabilize things by buying up shares in bulk, and it did work, but only temporarily. Then came Black Monday, October 28th, and Black Tuesday, October 29th. On Black Monday, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged nearly 13% in a single day, and the next day it fell another 12%. To put it into perspective, between September and November of 1929, the stock market lost more than $30 billion in value, nearly 10 times the federal budget at the time. The Dow Jones continued to fall. From its high of 381 points in September of 29, it bottomed out at just 41 points in July of 32, an 89% drop. And the pain wasn't just limited to investors. Over 9,000 banks failed during the Depression, wiping out people's life savings. Unemployment, which was 3% in 29, skyrocketed to 25% by 33. Industrial production fell by nearly 50%, and global trade plummeted by over 65% as nations turned inward. And the GDP of the United States dropped by almost 30%. The Great Depression wasn't just a financial downturn. It was a total system failure that affected every layer of American life. And it was uniquely devastating because of how deep, long-lasting, and wide-reaching it became. And there was many reasons for why it was so bad. Well, for one, there was no federal unemployment benefits, no food stamps, no Social Security, and no deposit insurance. So when the crisis hit, people didn't just lose their jobs, they lost everything. Over 9,000 banks collapsed between 1929 and 33. People lined up outside banks hoping to withdraw their savings, only to find the doors locked and their money gone. With no FDIC, which wasn't created until 1933, millions lost their entire life savings. And another reason was unemployment. By 1933, the US unemployment rate had soared to 25%. In some cities like Toledo or Detroit, it reached 50% or higher. And those who kept their jobs only saw their wages cut in half. People were reduced to standing in bread lines and relying on soup kitchens for food. Families moved in together, children left school for work, and people sold whatever they could just to survive. To make matters worse, farmers had already been suffering throughout the 1920s from overproduction and failing prices. So when the Depression hit, it absolutely crushed them. And then came the Dust Bowl. Starting in 1930, severe drought and overfarming turned once fertile land into dust. Crops failed, livestock died, and entire towns were abandoned. Thousands of families fled west, many ending up in migrant camps in California. Now, Congress tried to protect American businesses when they passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930. It raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods, intending to boost domestic production. But it backfired. Major trading partners retaliated with tariffs of their own, and global trade collapsed. And within just 2 years, world trade dropped by over 65%, worsening the depression both at home and abroad. Now American farmers and manufacturers lost foreign markets just when they needed them the most. The Great Depression shattered faith in the American economic system. Hardworking families who had followed the rules, bought homes, saved money, started businesses, were ruined at no fault of their own. Suicide rates spiked, marriage and birth rates plummeted, and for many, the American dream had died. When the stock market crashed in 1929, Herbert Hoover had only been president for a few months, and he was known as a brilliant organizer and humanitarian. He was the man who helped feed millions in Europe after World War I. But when the Depression hit, his instincts failed him. Hoover believed in limited government intervention, what we now call hands-off or laissez-faire approach. He thought the economy would correct itself if people stayed calm and confident. He once stated, "Economic depression cannot be cured by legislative action or executive pronouncement." So instead of direct relief, Hoover encouraged voluntary cooperation. He urged businesses not to cut wages and charities to help the poor. He refused to provide federal aid to individuals, fearing that would make them dependent on government handouts. And, meanwhile, unemployment and poverty kept rising. As more Americans lost their jobs and homes, they built shanty towns on public land, makeshift shelters made from scrap wood, tarps, and cardboard. These growing slums were sarcastically called Hoovervilles, a bitter jab at the president that they blamed for their misery. Hoover blankets were newspapers people used to stay warm. Hoover flags were empty pockets turned inside out, and even Hoover leather referred to cardboard used to patch worn-out shoes. And these were not isolated camps. They existed outside nearly every major city in the United States, from New York to Seattle. To add further insult to injury, one of the darkest moments in Hoover's presidency came in 1932, when over 20,000 World War I veterans marched to Washington, D.C. to demand early payment of their wartime bonuses. They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or the Bonus Army. The veterans set up camp along the Anacostia River, hoping Congress would pass a bill to give them their promised bonuses early, instead of in 1945. But the bill failed. Hoover ordered the military to remove them, and what happened next stunned the nation. General Douglas MacArthur, along with help from Major Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton, led troops armed with bayonets, tear gas, and tanks to drive out the unarmed veterans, many with their families. Tents were burned, people were injured, and a few died, and all of this was caught by the media. Rightly so, Americans were horrified. These were not just rioters, these were war heroes, now homeless and hungry, and the government had turned their backs on them. Hoover tried to defend his actions by stating that the Bonus Army was infiltrated by radicals and communists, but the damage to his reputation was done. The Great Depression wasn't just confined to the United States. It sparked a global economic collapse, leading to political upheaval and creating the perfect storm for extremist movements and global conflict. The US had been the world's largest creditor after World War I, and when its economy crumbled, it sent shockwaves across the globe. The stock market crash of 1929 marked the beginning of a chain reaction that crippled countries dependent on American loans and trade. Germany, still reeling from the harsh treatment of the Treaty of Versailles, could not keep up with reparations owed to the Allies. And as the Depression deepened, Germany defaulted on these payments, further destabilizing its economy, leaving the country vulnerable to political extremism. Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931, a drastic move to devalue the pound and try to salvage its economy. This sparked competitive devaluations and a currency war among countries trying to protect their trade balance. And Latin American countries, heavily reliant on the export of raw materials and commodities, were hit hard by failing global demand. Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico saw their economies collapse, fueling instability, leading to military coups in several nations. In 1932, with the country still reeling from the Great Depression, voters turned to a new face for hope, FDR. He ran on a platform of bold reforms and a promise to provide relief, recovery, and reform to the American people. FDR's message resonated deeply with the population desperate for change, and he won the presidential election in a landslide, securing more than 57% of the popular vote and sweeping 42 states. Upon taking office in 1933, FDR wasted no time. He immediately declared a bank holiday to stop the run on banks, closing them temporarily to prevent further collapse. He then set in motion a series of sweeping reforms known as the New Deal, aimed at providing further immediate relief to those suffering, recovering the economy, and to prevent future depressions. One of the most significant aspects of FDR's New Deal was the creation of various government agencies, known as the alphabet agencies, to tackle specific issues. These agencies would provide relief, support infrastructure, and regulate the economy. Some of the most notable ones included the following. The Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC, created jobs for young men in public work projects like building parks, planting trees, and flood control. The Works Project Administration, or the WPA, employed millions of people in construction and public service jobs, including building roads, bridges, and public buildings. The National Recovery Administration, or the NRA, set industry-wide codes to regulate wages, prices, and working conditions in an attempt to boost industrial recovery, although it was later declared unconstitutional. The Social Security Administration, or the SSA, established Social Security, providing unemployment insurance and pensions for the elderly, a landmark step in the creation of the modern welfare state. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or the FDIC, insured deposits in banks to prevent future runs on banks and stabilize the banking system. And the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, which regulated the stock market to prevent fraud and protect investors, restoring trust in the financial markets. While the New Deal didn't end the Depression overnight, it had significant long-term effects. It restored confidence in the banking system, put millions of people back to work, and it laid the foundation for a more secure economic future. FDR's leadership was instrumental in stabilizing the country, and he became a symbol of hope and resilience for millions of Americans. While the New Deal brought relief and recovery, it wasn't until World War II that the United States fully emerged from the Great Depression. American industries, once struggling with high unemployment and low production, were suddenly tasked with producing vast quantities of war materials, from tanks to planes to ammunition. Factories retooled, and millions of workers, many of them women and minorities who had previously been excluded from the workforce, were employed in manufacturing roles. The demand for military goods created an unprecedented boom in American production. This surge helped not only reduce the unemployment rate dramatically, but also jump-started a period of sustained growth that lasted for decades. The war didn't just boost factory production, it reinvigorated entire sectors of the economy, from manufacturing to agriculture. Americans who had struggled to make ends meet in the 1930s were now working full-time, earning wages that fueled consumer spending, and sparked a broader economic recovery. The Great Depression reshaped America forever. Never again did Americans want to deal with such a catastrophe, so they worked tirelessly to create a country with a more resilient economy. But beyond government action and policy, the Great Depression's legacy is still alive today because so many people alive today had grandparents or great-grandparents that lived through it. These first-hand accounts, the lessons learned from their hardships, and the impacts on families are passed down through the generations. It shapes how many of us view money, saving, and economic security. And the cautious financial habits that many people still practice today, whether it's avoiding excessive debt or taking a more conservative approach to investing, can often be traced back to the lessons learned from the Great Depression. The Great Depression was a time of immense hardship, but also of resilience and reform. It showed how quickly prosperity could vanish and how necessary it was to have safeguards in place. The Roaring Twenties may have ended in disaster, but what followed helped build the foundation for the modern American economy. Let me know in the comments down below if you have any family members or friends who experienced the Great Depression, and what was it like? And with that, I'm Evan, and thanks for watching. If you liked what you just saw, then click on the video here. Also, if you haven't, like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any future videos.